Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Pete Absolon? He is the topic of an article written in Outside Magazine titled The Death of Pete Absolon. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. Peter Absolon was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1960. He mostly was raised in Texas and Maryland. He went by the name Pete. As a teenager, Pete became interested in hiking and mountain climbing. In 1983, he graduated from George Washington University with a bachelor's degree. He became a climbing guide at Seneca Rocks in West Virginia. In 1986, he met a woman named Molly. The couple would marry in 1988. In 1990, the couple moved to Lander, Wyoming, where Pete took a position as an instructor at the National Outdoor Leadership School. He was an avid climber who spent a lot of time training and teaching others how to climb safely. He traveled all around the world on various climbing adventures. In 2000, Pete and Molly had a daughter named Avery. After this, Pete was even more cautious with his climbing activities. In May 2007, Pete became the Rocky Mountain Regional Director at the school where he worked. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On Saturday, August 11, 2007, 47-year-old Pete and a 30-year-old instructor at the school where he worked named Steve Harrelly were climbing in the southern end of the Wind River Range near Lander, Wyoming. Specifically, they were on Leg Lake, which was an area that local residents would climb occasionally, but it was not a popular attraction for climbers in general. Pete was familiar with climbing in various parts of the world, including Wyoming, but he had never attempted this particular climb before. He planned his route carefully. Pete and Steve had known each other since 2001. Both men were excited about the adventure. The men reached a point where the climb was getting particularly difficult. Steve left his two dogs at the base of a cliff as the men continued up a steep ascent. They decided that their goal for the day would be a grassy ledge, which was about 150 feet away. The men were about 800 feet above Leg Lake Basin. At this moment, the lives of these two men were about to intersect with other people who were not far away. 23-year-old Luke Rodoff was in a group of 8 adults and 4 children who were hiking in the area that day. Included in the group were Luke's brother Aaron, a cousin named Eli, and a family friend named Eric McDonald. The group had been hiking in the area since Thursday, August 9. On Saturday, August 11, Luke and Aaron wanted to take Eli and Eric to Leg Lake. The trail did not continue all the way to their destination. After leaving the trail, the group of 4 did not see any other people. They reached a cliff that had a view of the lake. They stayed there for about a half hour and threw several rocks toward the lake. At about 5 p.m., the 4 men hiked to another cliff about a quarter of a mile away. This cliff had a 15-foot overhang above the basin. They thought that it would be an ideal place from which to throw rocks. Luke looked over the edge and didn't see anybody. He grabbed a 15 to 20-pound rock and threw it over the edge. In order to watch the rock make its journey all the way to the basin, Luke leaned over farther and could see more of what was below the overhang. At this point, he noticed 2 men wearing white helmets about 200 feet below him. These men were Pete and Steve. Luke had not seen these men until he leaned more over the edge. By this point, it was too late. Luke watched helplessly as the rock, which was the size of a bowling ball, smashed into Pete's helmet and killed him instantly. The members of Luke's party immediately called 911, and the group started heading down toward the Leg Lake Basin. After the rock smashed into Pete's helmet, Steve was disoriented for a moment after hearing the crashing sound. As he looked over at Pete, he noticed that his climbing partner's eyes were fixed straight ahead and his mouth was open. Steve turned Pete around and saw that his helmet had been destroyed and there was blood everywhere. In that moment, Steve realized that Pete had died. It was too dangerous to take Pete's body back down the cliff, so Steve took the gear that he needed from Pete's body and made his way down alone. It took him about an hour to get to the basin. After Steve made it back to the camp and retrieved his dogs, he saw Luke, Aaron, Eli, and Eric running toward him. Aaron said to him, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Steve responded, "What happened?" Luke stepped forward and said, "I threw a rock." Steve said, "Did it hit another rock or something?" Luke replied, "No, that was the rock." Steve said to Luke something like, "I forgive you," or "I forgive you for that." Later, Steve would say that he regretted making that statement. After spending some time praying, the group split up. Aaron, Eli, and Eric made their way back to their camp, as Luke and Steve stayed behind. They spent the night talking around a campfire, which must have been pretty awkward considering that Luke had thrown the rock that killed Steve's friend. Steve asked Luke why he simply didn't leave the area without saying anything, like why didn't he attempt to dodge responsibility. Luke told him that he could not run from God and was willing to do whatever was needed to make things right. The next day, the men hiked to Steve's pickup truck and drove back together to the city of Lander. On the same day, a rescue team from Grande National Park used a helicopter to retrieve Pete's body. 11 days after Pete was killed, the Fremont County Attorney, Ed Newell, announced that there would be no charges filed in this case, although he believed that Luke's actions were criminally negligent or reckless. Ed listed a number of factors to support his decision not to prosecute. For example, Luke was extremely remorseful. He took full responsibility for his actions. He did not intend to kill Pete. Luke had no criminal history and served in the military. The probability of any given rock striking somebody after being thrown off a cliff is extremely low. And he was not sure how society would benefit from Luke being incarcerated. It just seemed punitive to put him in prison. Ed felt as though this case was more appropriate for civil litigation. It was not really in the realm of the criminal justice system. According to Pete's wife, Molly, Ed told her that he was not sure he could convict Luke, like maybe he couldn't convince a jury, because everybody throws rocks. Molly was not pleased with the decision not to prosecute. She believed that Luke should have been held accountable. Later, Molly remarried and moved to Idaho. Luke continued to express remorse for his behavior. After the incident, he worked as a landscaper in Casper, Wyoming. Now moving to my analysis. The outcome of the Pete Absolon case has led to a lot of division. There are two different debates in the situation. One debate is about whether or not Luke actually committed a crime. The other debate involves the issue of facing the consequences if a crime had been committed. Like, should Luke have been prosecuted even if he was responsible? I will examine both of these issues, starting with the debate over guilt and innocence. Let's take a look at the factors both for and against the idea that Luke committed a crime when he threw the rock that killed Pete. Starting with the inculpatory factors. Luke admitted that he threw a 15 to 20 pound block of granite from a cliff overhang down into a basin. This was not accidental. He picked it up and deliberately launched it over the edge. There was no reason to do this other than entertainment value. It wasn't like he was fighting off a bear who was scaling the side of the cliff. The rock that Luke threw over the edge is the one that struck and killed Pete. Luke admitted that he saw the rock slam into Pete. It wasn't like the rock that Luke tossed hit another rock, which in turn struck Pete. This would have made it much more difficult to predict. The rock that killed Pete was the same one that Luke sent over the edge. Any reasonable person would have known that a 15 to 20 pound rock thrown from a high elevation could be lethal. It's not like Luke was expecting the rock to float up in the air. The rapid and uncontrolled descent of the rock was part of the fun. He wanted to see it bounce into the side of the cliff and continue to the basin. Even though Luke looked over the edge before throwing the rock, he did not look far enough. He did not actually see the area where the rock would be traveling until after he threw it. Luke did not think anyone was there, but he didn't know for sure. If he had just taken a moment to look all the way, he would have seen Pete and Steve. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. The area where Luke and his companions were hiking did not see a lot of foot traffic. It is estimated that only about one climbing party a year enters the Leg Lake area. Luke believed that no one else was near him and his party. Again, his group had not encountered any people since leaving the trail. The chances of a rock thrown from a cliff striking and killing someone are very low. One study showed that 7% of mountain climbing fatalities are caused by falling rocks, so it's not unheard of, but very few cases involved rocks that were thrown. Often the rocks fall because hikers accidentally make contact with them as they're climbing up. So one hiker will accidentally cause a rock to fall, and the rock will strike another hiker below them. A lot of factors had to align for the rock that Luke threw to strike and kill Pete. A person could have stood on that overhang and threw a rock every second for 1,000,000 years and not fatally struck someone. To say that this was a low probability event is the understatement of the millennium. It was closer to a one-time in the history of Wyoming event. Even though Luke did not properly view the path that the rock would take, he did look before throwing. He did not get a complete view of the area, but he did make some effort. He was not being completely reckless. Throwing rocks off mountains is a very common behavior for climbers. One person who had been acquainted with Pete said that even Pete threw rocks, although he looked before doing it. When considering all the evidence, do I think that Luke committed a crime when he killed Pete with the rock? Yes, I believe Luke's actions rose to the level of criminal. It was his responsibility to verify that no one was in the path of the rock. Imagining a different scenario may bring clarity to evaluating this case. For example, if Luke had been launching rocks using a small cannon, and one of those rocks struck and killed someone, I think many people would believe he was guilty of some type of crime. However, because he used gravity to accelerate the rock, people think that he wasn't guilty. The use of gravity seems natural, whereas the use of a cannon is clearly intentional. In reality, the use of gravity to propel the rock is no different than the use of a cannon. Both are predictable, and both result in a rock traveling at a speed that can cause a fatality. Luke knew the effect that gravity would have on the rock. As a matter of fact, he was counting on it. There is no such thing as a gravity defense. Moving to the next question, should Luke have been prosecuted? As I mentioned, the Fremont County Attorney came up with a number of reasons why Luke should not be prosecuted. Luke's high level of remorse, the low probability of the event, no criminal history, no intent to harm, and Luke's military service. I think the unlikely nature of the event and the lack of intent to harm support not pursuing charges, but the other factors are more relevant for sentencing than they are in a decision to prosecute or not. I believe that Luke should have been prosecuted because his behavior was reckless. There was no reason that Pete had to die on that mountain. As far as a penalty, I don't believe that Luke should have gone to prison or even had a permanent criminal record. This case would have been appropriate for a deferred judgment, like he could have been convicted, completed some community service and probation, and then had his record expunged. The criminal justice system is not helpful for every type of situation involving unnecessary death. There are fatalities which are better addressed through civil litigation. However, prosecuting in this case would have been not only potentially helpful to Pete's family, I think it would have been good for Luke as well. Luke really struggled after Pete's death. He repeatedly accepted responsibility. He said that Pete's death was his fault and he could never justify it. Luke felt terrible about what happened. He may have suffered even more because he never had the opportunity to fully experience the consequences of his behavior. When talking about the decision not to prosecute, Luke said, "I don't know if it was a relief or not." The criminal justice system deals with remorseless people so often. It's hard to imagine someone like Luke, a person who actually desired to be held accountable. It's almost like the system did not have any way to deal with him. Luke is one of the few perpetrators that probably would have suffered less by being sent to prison, because outside of prison, he has to face his guilt and shame without any mitigating factors. Now moving to my final thoughts. The case of Pete Absolon involves a reckless death of a dedicated mountain climber. The perpetrator's recklessness was enough to outweigh all of Pete's safety efforts, like wearing a helmet. The rock-throwing offender was not a remorseless or callous person, but did act impulsively, which can generate the same result. Luke wanted to watch a rock speed toward the ground, but instead watched his impulsivity destroy an innocent life. Those are my thoughts in the case of Pete Absolon. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.